We look forward to today's discussion with President Carter and Dean Douglas Hicks of Oxford College on the subject of leadership. Dean Hicks, welcome to the Carter Center.
Well, I wanted to start out and ask you about your childhood and growing up in Plains, Georgia. You've written a lot about your parents and role models. I'd like to ask you when you started thinking about yourself as a leader, when those around you started using that term or talking about you as a leader or as a future leader.
I don't think I ever thought about leadership as a subject until I was in the Navy. And then, of course, I was at the Naval Academy for a while, and I was an ensign, and every naval officer is always talking about how I'm going to get promoted, so that was my first thought about leadership. But then we had a very severe and incisive courses at Naval Academy about what comprises leadership. And I would say that the first mandate for a leader was to tell the truth. And that was the one thing at the Naval Academy that would get you instantly dismissed without any further discussion if you were caught making a misleading statement or telling a lie. So that was it. And when you went on Christmas vacation, you were not supposed to get married and so forth. And when you came back, they would ask you, did you get married on vacation? And if you said yes, I think they would discharge you. But if you said no, they would discharge you even quicker. So I would say telling the truth was the most, because you can't have any confidence among your subordinates on a ship or in Plains, Georgia, or at Emory University or at Oxford, unless they have confidence in what you say being accurate.
And when you were running for president, you said that you'd never tell a lie, that you'd be straightforward, that you'd uphold character, and you wouldn't be afraid to talk about controversial issues. I'm not going to ask you about controversial issues, but I do want to ask you about that honesty. Do you still believe, as firmly as you did then, that politicians should never tell a lie and be accurate in everything that they say?
And, sometimes you have to avoid answering a question, but that's a legitimate encounter with the news media or anyone else. If it's something that they ask you about that you can't reveal publicly, you just have to say, I can't comment on that. But if you make a flat statement for the benefit of the news media, which is therefore to the public, then I would say that telling a lie is a very serious defect.
Now, when you gave your Nobel lecture, you cited one of your school teachers in Plains, and I believe it was Mrs. Julia Coleman.
That's to mention my school teacher, because I quoted her when I got the Nobel Peace Prize and also when I was inaugurated as president. I think I'm the only president that ever quoted a high school teacher in his inaugural address. But Ms. Julia used to say, we must accommodate changing times, but cling to principles that never change. And I think that's been the overall thing that I've remembered all through my life, and I've tried to apply it in my life whenever a question comes up about how I should behave.
When we think of your own identity in public life, you've been very vocal, perhaps the most vocal president in history in terms of talking about your faith. And in fact, in your Nobel lecture and other times, you've done really a confession of faith. You say, I believe in Jesus Christ, and move forward, talk about his life as a Jew who reached out to the alienated and so forth. And then you talked about interfaith things. But why do you feel it's so important from your perspective to share that grounding of who you are when you're leading the public?
Well, we worship Jesus Christ as a Prince of Peace. And bringing peace in my own family and to those around me in Plains, Georgia, or at Emory University, where I've taught now for this will be my 39th year, or as president, was very important to me. And I not only tried to keep our own country at peace, and I was successful in doing that. We never dropped a bomb or launched a missile or fired a bullet while I was president. And that's only happened 16 years out of the 242 years that our country's been in existence. So 16 out of 242 is almost a miracle in having good fortune and that sort of thing. But I try to maintain peace and promote human rights. And the human rights aspect is very important to Jesus Christ and to other religions. I'm not knocking other religions when I say that. Because equality of human beings, whether you're crippled or blind or have leprosy or whether you're not a believer in the same faith that Jesus espoused, or whether you're African American or white person, or whether you're an immigrant or someone seeking to live here. I think the main foundation of all human rights is to seek equality among people. And for me as president and as governor before that, I think the essence of it was to keep the peace and to provide equality of treatment. And if some people in the area where you happen to be prominent, which can just be a tiny town or it can be just your own family, or whether you have a president have 360,000 million people living on it, I think to try to equalize the opportunity to take advantage of whatever talent or ability God gives you.
I wonder if you could talk about how, when you negotiated the Camp David Accords and in all the work you've done on peacemaking, you think about those psychological factors and getting past the surface to what's really going on to try to bring people together.
I think the basic cause of our success at Camp David and the peace treaty that's lasted now for more than 42 years between Israel and Egypt is primarily because all three of us were deeply religious. And we constantly went back to our own individual religion. Begin was a very devout Jew. In fact, he was the first prime minister of Israel that was very devout, even before he was prime minister. And Sadat, had a brown spot on his forehead where he had knelt down and put his face on the ground since he was a child. And I was a Christian too. So we found a lot of common ground among us, despite the disparity in our own particular faith. And so we tried to extract from our own individual religions a guidance for us in trying to make sure that everybody was treated equally before God. And I think that all of us, all of our religions do elevate the importance of peace. So peace was successfully negotiated. Equality was not. And the Palestinians now still suffer from gross inequality, although that was the other part of Camp David. We had two parts. One was peace between Israel and Egypt, and the other was the rights of the Palestinians. We failed in that because of subsequent decisions by many people.
You speak so eloquently and lived peacemaking with Sadat and Begin and so many others, finding those principles of peace in your traditions. And yet, for many people, religion is a conversation stopper, and it is a source for excluding other people and for opposing oneself from those with another identity. And so how is it that you can pull the principles of peace and justice and equality from a tradition, and yet others seem to put those to the side and find violence or other parts that are also part of those sacred texts? If you look, you can find violence,
That's
you can
true.
find misogyny and many other homophobia and so forth.
Well, that's true, and all the religions have that fallibility. One of the deepest commitments of our human rights program here at the Carter Center is equality between men and women. And I wrote a book about that a few years ago, about the abuse of women and girls around the world. And we've found as we've gone into it more deeply, particularly on a religious basis, to get directly to your question, that that when you examine the details of the Quran, it's just as broad-based and fair to women as the Bible is. And we have gone to Africa and other places where Islam prevails, and extracted leadership. And we spent a lot of our time in recent years just sharing with Muslims about how they can also elevate the status of women to equality.
We talked another time about Reinhold Niebuhr and Richard Niebuhr and theologians who have tried to address the American experiment. And one of the key distinctions made there and connections is between justice and love or mercy.
Yes.
And I've been so interested in your work in your lifetime. You've been a public official and worked on legal change and on justice specifically and directly. And yet a lot of your volunteer work through Habitat for Humanity, through many organizations, deals more with love and charity, if you will. I wonder if you could talk about how you see the connection between justice and charity.
Well, I can't say that I disagree profoundly with Reinhold Niebuhr or others, but Reinhold Niebuhr said that the ultimate goal of politics is justice in a sinful world, he added. And whereas in religion, the ultimate goal is love and care for other people, and you can't always, in a religious organization, it's very difficult to always rely on love, because we always have a temptation to believe that our country is superior. And in the past and now, sometimes our country is based on the belief of our citizens collectively. Our country feels that we can go to war and try to force other people to adopt our principles because we think our principles are better than theirs. So, as I said before, the United States has been at war almost every year of our existence. And I say most of the wars in my lifetime have been ill-advised. I was in the submarine in the Pacific Ocean during the Korean War, and I was in the Navy in the Second World War. My son was in Vietnam and so forth. But I would say that the Korean War and the Vietnam War and the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan and the war in Yemen are all ill-advised. I think they were not necessary. So I can see how an ideal of Christianity can be based on love, and I think that most governments in the world can't apply love for one another as the ultimate thing, because I think they fallaciously adopt war instead of peace. And that, I can't say that I would disagree with the United States' decision to go to war in World War I and World War II. I didn't mean that. So I'm not a complete pacifist, but I think whenever possible, we ought to maintain peace instead of war.
So it sounds like you would want nation states and politics to think about love as well as justice, but you're also saying that we haven't quite established justice, that we haven't achieved that much.
That's correct. I think one of the basic human rights of a human being is to be able to live in peace and not live in a war-torn environment, either locally or nationally.
The students wanted to ask you about failure. Looking at your work with the Carter Center, it seems like you accept failure as a possibility without being too worried about the risks. In fact, that's on the website, that you're willing to fail.
It is.
Do you think failure is an important step in leadership? And how do you react and come back from a failure that blows away your best efforts?
You know, one of the things I tried for when I was just out of a Naval Academy was a Rhodes Scholarship. And I was a finalist in the Southeastern region, and I finally failed. And but I didn't feel like that was a major setback in my life. But I think all the way through, we need to be willing, as we explore goals for ourselves in life, as we change constantly, to accept the possibility of failure, if you think that the success is worthwhile. And so we undertake a lot of projects at the Carter Center that might be very difficult and so forth. And I made one of our basic principles of the Carter Center, as you pointed out, that we don't let the prospect or possibility of failure deter us from undertaking major and risky things. So what we've tried to do at the Carter Center is, our number one goal in the Carter Center is to undertake difficult subjects and to try to fill vacuums in the world. We adopted 5 diseases on Earth to eradicate, knowing that we couldn't succeed in all of them, but we have gotten very close to some of them, and we don't let that deter us. And we want to promote human rights to be all pervasive. We know that's not possible, and Habitat, wants to eliminate substandard housing for everybody in the world. That's impossible. We go to work on Habitat houses every year, knowing that we can't succeed totally, but we have to do what we can to reach that goal, do our own part, I'd say, to reach that goal. So partial failure and setbacks and disappointments are sometimes inevitable, and but if we want to succeed in trying to make the world better, we have to do what we are capable of doing and not be afraid to try.
So what should college students be doing now in terms of experiences and activities, besides, of course, interning at the Carter Center, to prepare themselves to lead?
Just figure out who in your community or down the street from you, or not talking about at Oxford, I'm talking about back home where you live, and make a pledge maybe today. Within the next month, I'm going to do something good for the one person in my acquaintance whom I know needs a friend or needs a loving hand, and just try to help somebody else. Those kind of real small things can mount up. I think our country would be better if everybody would just try to help the people next door that they know and who are in need.
I wanted to come back to the discussion of women and girls. One of the students asked this. You once said that one of the biggest global challenges and abuses of human rights in the world is the mistreatment of women and girls.
I said the greatest.
The greatest. All right.
Yeah.
This is still prevalent still a prevalent issue in many countries.
Yeah.
What do you think that we as individuals can do to help further women's rights and advance the proper treatment of women in these countries?
Well, if we are male, then we should look at ourselves and see if we have any belief that men are superior to women in any category, and try to get rid of that inclination in our own minds. And if we're women, of course, we can point those out, the defects to men, and also to take a leadership role in some of the things about women's rights. This country is not immune from those. I think probably one of the most serious problems that I wrote about in my book recently was the slavery that exists now. Slavery is probably greater now in the world, certainly in dollar value, than it ever was in history.
In your book, Why Not the Best, written in 1975, you express the ambition of running for president and provide a detailed evaluation of yourself. When compared to your later experience of being the president, how accurate would you say your self-reflection is in that book? And is there any trait that you considered a disadvantage then to have become an advantage, or vice versa?
Well, I had already been governor when I wrote that book, and I knew what it meant to be in major public life and deal with the legislation, deal with a large constituency and so forth. But I would say that the primary difference between being a governor and being president is foreign affairs. And I had to learn a lot about keeping our own country at peace, which was very difficult and sometimes politically deleterious, and bringing peace to others. I would say that the major accomplishment of my administration in the long term, the major impact on global affairs was the normalization of relations with China. We had been at odds or at war with China for 35 years before I decided to normalize relations. And President Nixon had been over there and declared there was only one China, but he didn't say which one. And we, when I was president, we still looked on Taiwan as being the only, China. But anyway, I had a lot of changes in my own attitude that I had to make from necessity, but I had a lot of advisors, and as I said earlier in this discussion, I chose advisors that I knew from their past experience, basically that they agreed with me on peace and escalating human rights and things of that kind. So I had to learn a lot, and some things I didn't learn well enough, as was demonstrated in the 1980 election.
Can you walk us through the steps of what to do when your personal ethics go against your professional ethics? Or I believe your personal ethics might go against a professional decision that you face or a pressure in your profession to do something that you don't think is right.
Well, this might be a difficult thing for students to accept, but I think I would probably have been reelected president if I had taken military action against Iran. They took 50-something of our hostages, 56, I think. And I was advised by almost everybody of my advisors, we need to attack Iran. But I had a feeling that we should preserve the peace, and I thought also more practically that if we attacked Iran, they would probably kill our hostages the first thing. And my goal was to bring the hostages back safe and free. And so but that was one of the times when I maybe did the right thing. It turned out well, by the way. And it may have cost me the election, which I think was probably not good for the country, but that's a very biased assessment. My wife thinks that anyway. But anyway, so there are some times when you have to exert discipline on a ship, and when you need to be kind of buddy-buddy with the people that are subordinate to you.
Would you be willing to talk about how you dealt with that loss when you weren't reelected? Coming back to some of these other questions, how tough was that? How did you work through that yourself?
Well, I was assisted in overcoming my disappointment by trying to convince my wife that there were some good things about it. She was devastated, and Rosen was much more upset and angry with the American public and with my opponent and so forth than I was. And I tried to assuage her feelings and give all the reasons that we could have a good life ahead of us. I was only 56 years old then, and so forth. And so I think trying to assuage her kind of was the best stimulation I had to overcome the problem myself. And then when we had the vision of the Carter Center, I took a job at Emory University first of all, but then right after that we decided to form the Carter Center, and that has given us a tremendous boost in spirits and commitment and ambition, and it's also made life seem to be worthwhile for us. And I used a lot of what I had learned in the White House in my stature as a former president of the United States of America to gain access to people all over the world.
It's often said, and there's a consensus across the aisle, that you've been the most successful ex-president in the history of the country, at least in recent times. And I don't know, does that make you proud of, is that the legacy, how you'd like your legacy to be remembered?
Partially, yes. But I would like to add, maybe the best former president and one of the best presidents, but I can't add that on myself. Roosevelt kind of resents it when somebody says you're the best former president we've had, but I appreciate it because I value my life since the White House just as much as I do the 4 years I spent in the White House. I think what we've done at the Carter Center and so forth equals what I did as president.
Well, it does, and we as partners within Emory University are so proud to be associated with you, and to have this opportunity to talk with you about leadership is just fantastic. And to talk about understanding and practicing leadership, I can't think of a single human being that I'd rather sit next to and learn from, and I believe that my fellow faculty and staff and our students feel exactly the same way, and what an honor it is to share the Emory banner with you.
Doug, thank you.
Thank you so much.
It's been a real pleasure.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you.